Hi there. In this lecture we see Capablanca playing against Milan Vidmar. This is in the 1927 New York tournament round 12. E4 from Capablanca, we have E5, knight F3, knight C6, the Roy Lopez, the Morphy defense A6, bishop A4, knight F6, Capablanca castles, Vidmar plays bishop E7, we have rook E1, B5, so this looks like fairly standard stuff. D6, C3, knight A5, bishop C2, C5, D4, queen C7, knight BD2, black castles, H3, and now C6, knight C6. It is possible for black to consider C takes D4 here. This is reasonable, and white's advantage is only small here. But knight C6 encourages white to actually close the center. And in fact, Capablanca obliges with this. He does actually play D5. So, yeah, it's changed the whole nature of the possession, not playing C takes D4, basically, provoking this D5. So this is an interesting situation. We have A4, and now B4. This actually makes things a little bit worse than they needed to be. Rook B8 is perhaps more resilient here. And B4 is an interesting idea to try and fix down black's pawns. For example, this position, A takes, knight F1. This looks like an advantage for white, fixing those pawns and working on the queen side. But there's going to be a bit of work involved here. So yeah, rook B8 overall does seem as though it's an interesting move. But we have this B4. We have knight C4, yeah, using that lovely C4 square. A5. If knight E8, let's have a quick look what would happen here, knight E8 instead of A5, because A5 is a bit committal, putting another pawn on a dark square. There's quite a few pawns on dark squares here after A5. So let's examine this move instead, knight E8. So say C takes, bishop D3, G6. Let's just get a picture here. White could use the B6 square, that's the problem. If black doesn't play A5, white will play A5. If the B6 square is used, then the queen's kind of uncomfortable, for example like this, and then a move like queen A4 is looking at B4 as well. So it's not just nice to have a knight on B6, it's disconnecting that poor B4 pawn. So this is a great example, just fictional, for why A5 is a kind of, there's a case for it. So A5, not leaving this pawn kind of disconnected in some cases on B4. We have, though, a very nice move by Capablanca, which not just gets an advantage, but kind of potentially carries that towards endgames. So what do you think that move is here for 10 points? White play. Okay. It's also, acts as an undermining move. Knight F takes E5, undermining black's pawn chain. So here, bishop A6. If D takes D6, this pawn is a bit more lonely and a target. And we're also getting the dark square bishop, which is amplifying the fact that there's a lot of dark square pawns here, which could be a target to this bishop. So this position is very nice for white. So black inserts bishop A6. If we just look at that again for a moment, you might ask, what about queen D7? Well, actually, knight B6 here is possible. And then we can take out A8. Queen A7, we can actually do something very special here. What do you think that is for 5 points? Yeah, a bit of a trick here. There's knight takes E5, the bishop's still trapped. So this is even better. So, yeah, black does best to kind of play bishop takes D6, it seems. Or bishop A6. Bishop A6 first. We have bishop B3. And now, actually, D takes is played. D6. So we arrive at this scenario. Bishop takes D6 here. Queen takes D6. Queen takes D6. If queen B7, trying to avoid the queen exchange, knight takes A5 is possible. And here, even queen takes C5 is possible. So queen takes D6. So the queen's coming off. And some of those features mentioned, these dark square pawns as targets for this bishop, could become evident in endgames. And we have further simplification with knight B7. Knight takes B7, bishop takes B7, and now C takes B4. Now, black doesn't want to give a kind of outside passed pawn here by playing a takes. We have c takes b4. The other thing you might be questioning here, isn't knight takes e4 any good? What is white's best bet here, do you think? For 10 points. This is just analysis, but it seems the strongest move would be b5. This does create also a protected passed pawn. And this position, we're also going to be winning e5. Yeah, that's another big problem here. So yeah, this is quite interesting. b5. So just to look at that again, if f5, we just can nudge the knight, and if knight d2, we can play this first, rook e2, and then b3, and then rook takes e5. There's no real entry points here. This is an interesting aspect of this game. The entry points for black's rooks don't seem to exist. So c takes b4 is played. And if you look at this, yes, the bishop is covering these two squares, and the pawn is covering, this square, c3. So there's no entry points really on the c file for black. So we have f3 just supporting that center pawn. Rook fd8, bishop e3, h6, rook ed1. All white really needs to do is further simplify to get the rooks off, because this bishop has got lots of targets. It's quite a painful position for black with these dark square pawn targets around the place. Where there's targets, there's fun. Basically, if that's a rook on the 7th or a knight on f5, where you have targets, that's a lot of fun. There's a lot of fun to be had here in this endgame because of these targets. If rook dc8, rook ac1, if a pair of rooks comes off and another pair of rooks comes off, we're just going to play bishop b6. If knight d7, there's only a little trick here, but it doesn't really do anything. Say bishop d1, knight d3. Well, I can actually just play bishop c2 here, nudge the knight, and then take on b4, outside passed pawn. It's a big advantage, which is similar to the game anyway. Bishop c6, rook ac1, bishop e8, and now king f2 is played. I mean, there's other ways to play it as well. White could just take on d8 and play rook c5. And you might wonder, well, hang on, Kingscrusher, have I just made this up? What about rook d3? Guess what white has here? This entry point is not even useful. So do you see why for 10 points? It happens that this is possible. If rook takes e3, king f2, and the rook's kind of trapped. So what happens there? Eventually, the rook is going to be taken, or just has to give itself up. So yes, even that's possible. Rook takes d8, but king f2, rook takes, rook c8, and now g4. This gives the idea that actually sometimes, maybe this kind of thing would be useful, g4, but it also makes sure that there's no knight h5. Rook d2, I mean, let's examine rook d2. This position is going to be advantageous to white. Yeah, the dark square targets. h4 is also kind of possible. This position, if we get this position, we're going to play bishop b6 and rook d8. And, we get a position where g5 could be useful here, just winning material. So there's lots of ways to get an advantage, but g4 is interesting. So you can see how tactically that could help. Bishop d7. We have bishop b6. Bishop e6. If rook a8, let's say king e3 in this position, what happens here? Well, rook d8 will happen. If black doesn't play g5, white is considering h4 and g5. So let's say this. Yeah, basically there's a kind of zugzwang position emerging, and rook d8 is going to happen, and then a5 will drop. Bishop c4 might even be more accurate here. So this position, for example, is going to be favourable for white. So, okay, bishop e6, that's taken, f takes. If rook c2 check, king e3, f takes. There's just rook d2 here. We don't have to rush to take a5. Rook c6, bishop takes a5, big advantage. So f takes c6. Rook d8 check, yeah, it's a nightmare endgame scenario with all these dark square pawn targets. So Capablanca takes on a5, knight c5, b3, very neat. Get the knight to take on b3. Bishop takes b4, outside passed pawn. Knight d4, a5. Yeah, this is just winning. Black actually resigned here. If knight c6, bishop d2, knight b8, bishop c3 is another target on the dark square to be aware of. So that makes it even easier. All of these dark square targets basically make the position even easier. This is absolutely winning. 2 pawns up. So yeah, a fascinating game. It seems that the endgame transition process is an extremely powerful one. And the middle game combination kind of got the favourable imbalance in a way when knight takes e5 was played. Let's just recap here. In this closed position, it's kind of collecting the dark square bishop and simultaneously leaving lots of targets on dark squares. Targets are fun, and this bishop is going to have a lot of fun basically against all of those dark square pawns later. So yeah, very, very interesting positional game, showing the power of endgame transitioning and middle game combinations in the context of endgames to see where the targets will remain. And as simplification occurs, these targets really become more and more exploitable. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks so much.